this stuff out. In the times of COVID, we have not yet figured out all of the answers to our technology. But here we go, here we go, here we go. There. All right. Thank you for joining me this evening for my first What I Learned in Grad School little micro workshop. I'll talk a little bit about the ideas behind this series that I'm doing. Tonight, we're going to be talking about BMI in research, which I'm not going to lie was a bit of my hook to bring you in to talk about research in general and research methods in general. It's actually a topic I'm deeply passionate about. And the research that I got a chance to do during my coursework this semester lent itself very well to conversation on research methods and ethics. And so I'll be talking about two courses from this semester. The first one, the biopsychosocial to counseling, we're just going to lay out the foundation for how we're going to be undertaking some of these conversations this evening, and then really kind of honing in on research methods a little bit. Who am I? That most of you who are watching this will already know me, but if for whatever reason you don't, I am above all other things a wife, mother, daughter, partner, friend, trainer, coach, counselor, student, teacher, community member, and above all things, a global citizen. I am a social scientist at heart, and I'm really passionate about taking complex information and making it palatable and accessible to people who may not be as familiar with the jargon, right? So breaking jargon down, helping people to understand the concepts as they relate to their lives, and putting out of reach information into the hands of the people who need it most. So that's been my driving passion for the last 10 years or so, and is very much what has guided me in undertaking this as we start to talk more about the relationship between the biological, psychological, and sociocultural sciences. So today we are going to cover just again a really quick welcome to what I learned in grad school. I'll talk about why I'm doing it and what I'm hoping to get out of the series. And then we will break it down into 6 parts. And these parts are not intended to be long. This is not going to be a super comprehensive workshop. It's just a snapshot to get us thinking about the topics more, and an opportunity for people to ask questions if they have them, maybe get interested in the scientific method, and get excited about some of the topics that we're looking at in exercise psychology. So part 1, we'll talk about the biopsychosocial framework. Part 2, we'll do a really fast, like 5-minute crash course in research methodology. Part 3, we'll talk about social justice as an ethical consideration in research. And then we're going to dive into BMI. And we're going to talk a little bit more about where it came from, how it's used, why that matters, and why it was such a great example of the point I'm trying to make in tonight's presentation, which will take us into part 5, BMI in research. Is it a baseline variable? Is it an indication of bias? We'll chat about how you can tell the difference. And then finally, part 6, a bit of a conclusion talking about moving forward and a new conceptual framework for research methodology. So what I learned in grad school. This was an idea that I came up with when I first started toying around the idea of going back to school in the first place, because goodness knows it's not like I have time. Running a full-time business with 2 young children and trying to keep up on volunteer work and efforts in the community, and trying to be a good friend and a good partner and all of these different things. Going back to school seemed like the furthest of the best ideas I've had. It was not on my radar. But we found ourselves in our business and in our nonprofit at an impasse where a lack of academic credentials was beginning to impact our ability to be taken seriously, because we still live in a world that really values academia and proof of knowledge. And that proof of knowledge usually comes in the form of a piece of paper that you can frame and put up on your wall. And so sending me back to school to provide proof of knowledge was important in order to continue pressing forward some of the conversations we were having. My goals here are four main principal kind of themes. I want to help you connect concepts, and I want to connect concepts for myself of what I'm learning in school and how that applies to a real life setting. I want to share knowledge so that I can take in some of your knowledge as well and inspire interesting dialogue, right? And hopefully in all of this, create change and identify some gaps or some areas of need that we can refine and that we can start to reconceptualize and rethink. So that's why I'm here, and hopefully you're here for the same reasons. So move this over here for right now, and actually just take you right out of the way. Good. The biopsychosocial cultural environmental framework is not only a mouthful, but it is a really important way of looking at the world. And in this context, we're going to talk really specifically about well-being and health. That being said, this is an idea, a concept, a worldview that translates into many different industries. So you may have heard about it in education or early childhood development, all of these different things. Now, I would argue that everything comes down to health, because I believe that our education and our social support systems and even our economy and our government comes down to quality of life and how well we're able to live the very best lives that we want to in this relatively short time we have on this planet. So the biopsychosocial cultural environmental framework started as the biopsychosocial framework, talking about how the mind and the body and our social relationships are all interconnected and intertwined. And because of that, very interdependent upon each other. How you are emotionally and socially will, of course, impact your body. How you are feeling physically will impact your social relationships and your mental health. So that one was relatively easy for people to kind of pull their head around when it was first launched about 40 years ago. I think 40 years ago last year, actually. Cultural and environmental considerations got added a little bit later, and I want to just touch a little bit on those two words. When we're talking about cultural in this context, we're not only talking about cultural ethnicity and cultural race. We're talking about culture as a subpopulation and grouping that emerges within a big population. So we can also be talking about the culture of disability and the culture of sexual orientation. So all these different cultures kind of exist within our big social framework, and then they subdivide into their own subcultures. And we have kind of pockets of commonality between people where people have shared interests and language. And again, not just English as a language, but terminology and jargon and expressions that they use to identify each other. And so that's what we mean when we're talking cultural here. It's a little bit broader than just race and ethnicity, but of course, race and ethnicity will be a very predominant factor of that conversation. When we're talking about environmental, there's kind of a twofold thing here. The first one is your immediate direct environment. So the spaces that you occupy, and that can include how you navigate even accessibility of buildings and accessibility of transportation, right? So the actual environment that you are maneuvering yourself through. But more and more, we're also seeing major considerations on the actual environment, right? Things like climate change, things like shifting in terms of major global events. A pandemic, for example, would be a big environmental or global factor that impacts us and would, of course, impact all of our biological, psychological, social, and cultural frameworks. So they're kind of a little bit broader than what we sometimes think about in terms of those terms. When we talk about whole person health, we're thinking in terms of our bodily experiences, but also our cognitive understandings. And so, what that means is not only our ability to feel and sense and perceive the world, but the constructs that we create around those feelings and senses and perceptions. That's cognition, right? So, the ability to think things through critically and to analyze them and apply those ideas in various contexts. We're talking about interpersonal relationships, how we engage with each other, with our families, our friends, our colleagues, all of those things. We're talking about social positioning, which is, if you've heard the term privilege or power dynamics, your social positioning is where a lot of the different factors of social structures and social dynamics kind of converge, and you sort of live on different locations. So being white-bodied would place you in a different social location than someone who is Indigenous, or being economically from a different socioeconomic background would again socially position you differently. And then we have our physical locations and our surroundings. So that's kind of what we're talking about in this framework. And that's about as far as I'm going to go into in terms of what I learned in biopsych, because it really was sort of this big concept and inviting people to think a little bit more holistically. And I think I had a bit of an advantage as a person with a background in sociology and as a person with a background in exercise, coming at it from kind of those different perspectives. So it was a really great course and an important course, and led to some interesting reflections in research methodologies, which I was actually really excited for because I am a geek. I love research. I am all about like, give me statistics, give me evidence, let me deconstruct it. And so I'm going to give you a really quick, like we are talking 5-minute course. I am going to time myself on this one. We are going to cover research type, purpose, credibility, ethic methods, and ethic participants, okay? The first one is our research type. Typically speaking, research gets divided into two major categories. You've got your quantitative and your qualitative. Quantitative deals primarily with numbers. It's interested in finding statistical analysis and relationships between things to be able to actually factually prove with data that things impact each other or are interrelated. So that's where we see causal relationships established if the research is really involved and has gone through multiple levels of analysis. Most of the time, we're going to see correlational research emerging. So this thing has been shown to have a relationship with this, but we don't have enough evidence to say that it causes that. And then often we will see kind of more superficial basic data emerging, population trends, all of that stuff as well. Qualitative data, on the other hand, is conversational and idea and thematic. So this is where we'll sit down in a focus group and say, tell me about your experience with this. And we're really looking to get into the personal subjective experience of a phenomenon. Both of these have tons of different ways of doing them. And all of those different ways should be chosen based on what your research question is. And so you'll run into really big complex terms like meta-analysis or quasi subjective studies and all of these different things. And really, essentially, what they're doing is justifying their use of a specific design based on the method that they chose. So that's that. Research needs to be purposeful, okay? It means that we need to have a clear and specific goal in mind when we're doing it, unless, okay, unless you're just kind of experimenting for the sake of experimenting and conducting pure research to see what happens. Usually, even then, we'll have a bit of an idea of what we think should happen. And I want to highlight this point really specifically. And the reason why is when we're talking about evidence-based practice and science, we often kind of poo-poo intuition and talk about observation as if it's not really credible information. And I want you to consider that, especially in this presentation, but in all that you engage with, intuition is the bedrock of inquiry, right? Someone somewhere thought, hey, this is worth looking at. This is worth studying. I see something and I've got a gut instinct that maybe these things are related. I'm going to see. And that is part of our scientific process. We intuitively know things as human beings long before we have the evidence to prove it. And so our reliance on methodology is how we structure and make credible information, but it is not actually in and of itself abolishing of instinct and intuition. Instinct and intuition is how we grow the body of evidence and learn new things. Research needs to be credible, okay? It needs to be accurate, thorough, and free from bias. Ooh, we're going to talk about that one tonight. And bias, of course, having a lot of methodological biases, but also just personal influence and personal beliefs, okay? It needs, if you're doing quantitative research, it needs to be reliable and valid. What that means is that it's replicable. We can do this again in different settings. We would see similar results. And valid means that the conclusions we're reaching are actually what the data is telling us. And those two things are how we know that something is credible. In qualitative research, it's a little more tricky because you're, of course, listening to people's subjective experiences and drawing conclusions out of them. So then we're looking for credibility and transferability. Again, is this able to translate to different spaces and different populations? Is the evidence dependable? Is it what we actually heard? Did we find ways to identify the themes accurately? And is it confirmable? Can we go back to the data and prove those results? So that's what we're looking for in terms of credibility. Those are pretty big benchmarks, okay? It's actually really important to consider all of those things. And then we get into our ethics, and we're looking at methods and our participants, because credibility is really big on that whole free from bias. So when we're looking at our research methods, we need to think about the aspects of the research themselves, and are they free from bias internally? Are there confounding variables? Are there problems with how the participants were selected? Are there issues with the constructs or the analysis, right? So we're getting really kind of technical on the methodology. Then we, of course, have our ethical considerations with participants, which refers to our privacy, autonomy, safety, and dignity, okay? And those things we want to really always be seeking to protect our participants and avoid causing them harm and distress. So a little statement here: high-quality scientific research is ethical, credible, rigorous, and transparent. And there's a lot of it, and that's wonderful, okay? But I would suggest that there is an absent category in all of this. I believe that we give a lot of conversation here to our ethics methods and our ethics participants, but we really neglect this part of the equation, which is our responsibility to the world, right? What are we putting out there, and what is the impact of that, right? Those who have been to Oppenheimer this summer would know of one of the biggest examples of that, right? Is a little bitty research study, little bitty, not so little bitty at all. But the consequences of this, of course, turning into the annihilation of a massive group of people, right? And so really being critical about how is what I am saying going to be used? What is the impact on the bigger population outside of my participants? And that's very much the angle I want to talk about in our discussion. So I just brought it up. What is social justice? And I have a much better expert in this than I do, but I'm going to define this really superficially for you because, again, I don't want to keep you here all night. Social justice at its core is a worldview that acknowledges that certain systems and structures in society can perpetuate inequality and that we must work to change or dismantle those systems. That's essentially what we're saying. Now, is it more complex? So much more complex. You can take a PhD in this, right? But at its core, we're saying there are legitimate issues at play in how our society has been organized and structured over time that reinforce differentiations between populations, that make it harder for some people to access things like human dignity and human rights, okay, or the ability to participate openly in the social process, things like voting, things like being able to have freedom of speech, and for that speech to be received by the people who need to receive it. Access, right? People having access to the resources they need to participate fully in society. So here we're talking about things like housing and transportation and money in general, right? And finally, of course, equity, that understanding that when we're talking about all of these things, different populations have different needs because of those stratified structures, because of the way things are laid out. It's a lot harder for some populations to overcome the barriers that would be typically expected by a population. So that's when we start talking about barrier reduction, and we start thinking really critically about how to support and accommodate people to push them up to the baseline. So it's not necessarily about elevating a population above and beyond others. It's about recognizing that that population's start point is so far behind that if they were to be in that race with everyone else, they wouldn't stand a chance. All we're trying to do is narrow the gap between the start lines. Okay, so that's what we mean when we talk about equity. And now what you all came here for, BMI. So with all of this, the conversation around social justice and the conversation around the bigger picture of ethics compels us to really critically think about ethics from that three kind of category model. BMI is one of those really easily deconstructed ideas that I'm hoping will open up conversation among us, an inquiry among us about more complicated constructs that we still use in research. So the reason why I chose BMI is because it's actually hyper controversial. And there are some very, very big arguments happening right now about how BMI is used in a clinical setting. Now, that has not yet translated to the research setting. We haven't seen any major dialogue happening in whether or not BMI should be included in research. But this body of work and other research, I'm sure, is going to start emerging saying, hey, if this tool is so problematic, maybe we should stop using it, right? Once upon a time, the norm of how we define the language of Indigenous peoples in Canada was very, very different. And so the social understanding of that happened before the research and applied understanding of that happened. People started to push back and say, we need new language, okay? Same idea here. So BMI 101. BMI was introduced in the 19th century by a statistician, mathematician, philosopher, who was trying to figure out if he could use the same science that had been inspired by Galileo to measure the distances between planets with this theory that they would fall into a nice little bell curve of distribution, probable distribution in the distances between the astral bodies. And so we had Adolf, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget his name. Give me 1 second. I'm going to look it up because it's important. This researcher was a Belgian researcher who said, I wonder if we can do that same thing with the human population. Adolf Quitlet, thank you. And he said, I'm going to try and figure this out. I'm going to try to measure the human population to determine the average man. If I can find all of the people and I can use probability and statistical analysis, I should be able to identify the average man. Now, interestingly enough, when you hear this story and you read the research, already we can see some major limitations with Quitlet's concept. In that one, he assumed the average man would be a man, despite the fact that there are unquestionably more women on the planet. In fact, evolution kind of necessitates a higher female population of humans to male human population. Again, that binary concept being problematic. But in Quitlet's time, we still would have known that there are more women and humans with a uterus on the planet than there are men. He also erroneously presumed that the average man would be white. And so a lot of his research revolved around this belief that the average man is a male who is white and probably lives in Europe. And so you can imagine that a statistical tool that's using this premise in how it's going about developing its methodology is going to have some issues with credibility and validity as we kind of start to use it in a much broader context. Okay, so now we've been using BMI since about the 1950s to measure and explore health. And that was actually introduced by insurance companies first. That's a whole other conversation. I should do a whole lecture just on the history of BMI. It's fascinating. But today I really want to talk about the limitations of BMI. Okay, so I'm going to outline 4 major ones with the overlying premise of the tool is inherently sexist and inherently racist. Okay, so literally the context in which it was developed is sexist and racist. But it's also really simplistic, okay? All BMI is designed to do is tell us the ratio between a person's height and their weight. That's it. That's all it's designed to do. It is a super, super simplistic tool that doesn't account for things like the difference in size of muscle mass density versus fat mass density, right? It doesn't talk about bones. It doesn't talk about body shape. And all of those things are actually a pretty big deal when you're looking at health. Okay, we talked about questionable reliability and validity. This is not only inaccurate in terms of, right, imagine a pregnant woman doing a BMI test. She's pregnant. Okay, it's obviously going to give us very, very different and unreliable, borderline invalid results because it doesn't distinguish between healthy and unhealthy body populations. Again, because it's not asking anything about that person themselves. This is really, really important because different ethnicities have different body mass distribution. Fat sits differently on our bodies in different ways and puts us at risk in different ways because there are some health risks associated with really high body fat levels, but those are really poorly identified by this tool. There are much more effective tools that look at them, and even then, those tools are correlative. So remember, we talked earlier, they are correlated to some health outcomes, but not causal to those health-related outcomes. So causal will be smoking and cancer. We know that smoking causes cancer. Excess body fat has been correlated with certain medical conditions that we think potentially might be influenced by weight. Okay. BMI doesn't tell us the whole story. It doesn't consider health factors beyond weight like fitness, diet, and lifestyle. And that's a really big deal because, again, we're seeing that a lot of people who are classified as overweight or obese actually don't have any of these health conditions and are doing just fine. But public health campaigns have been targeting them as if they are automatically unwell. Simultaneously, we know that many people not classified as overweight or obese have been missed by these campaigns and are not receiving the health care that they need. And ultimately, it perpetuates stigma and discrimination, which is something that, again, from that social justice angle, I think we need to think about really critically. Okay, so it can perpetuate weight bias and stigma, racism, again, we've talked about it, sexism, okay, major issues with this tool, and it's used to make decisions about people's access to healthcare and employment and other resource allocations, which makes it really problematic because a lot of people are having things limited to them based on a tool that doesn't say what we think it says. And so definitely a tool worth talking about. Let's take a look at the research really quickly, okay? And so again, touching on that research method, is it a baseline or is it a bias when we use BMI? The answer is it really depends on what it is you're studying and how you're using the tool. It's in and of itself, and I say this just on the left, it is a biometric tool that is in and of itself inherently neutral. BMI is not a bad tool. It is not a good tool. It is literally a ratio of height to weight. That's all it is. It tells you your relationship with gravity, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot beyond that. So everything else that we've concluded is extrapolating off of those correlations that we discussed, okay? How we use BMI defines whether or not it is ethical in our research. So let's talk about how we can use BMI. Sometimes it's an independent variable. So BMI is part of the inclusion criteria. So for example, experiences of women categorized as obese in gym settings. That's actually really important to study. We need to know the impact of weight stigma. We need to know how people who have been categorized by this are maneuvering through industries that have been defined by BMI and by weight bias, right? So I would argue that that's not only an ethical use of BMI, it's an inherently valuable use of BMI. And in many cases, research that does this will actually note we are using a really problematic tool. And so you can usually tell a really solid research by how they talk about the tools that they have in their methodology. BMI is usually used as a mediator or a moderator variable when we're talking about psychology research. Okay, so it's almost always there to help us identify the relationships between two other variables, either by creating that relationship or by moderating it and enhancing or minimizing the weight of that relationship, if you'll have me. So does BMI alter the relationship between self-esteem and self-exercise levels? I meant to say self-driven exercise levels. So does someone with a higher BMI experience a shift in self-esteem and a shift in exercise levels that would impact each other? And that's where that trifactor kind of comes in. Okay. And sometimes, especially in physiological research and health research, it will be a dependent variable where BMI itself is what we're trying to influence or test. Okay, so what is the weight loss outcome in a sedentary population undergoing a 6-week physical fitness program? We will measure it at the beginning and then we'll measure it at the end to see if there's any changes. Okay, so this last one really needs to be measured. It has to be precise. It's part of what we're actually looking at and integral to the validity of the study. This one here, our mediator and moderator, should probably be measured. We do sometimes see self-reported status come out. It depends on how it's being used in the research, but it's a good idea to measure it if you're doing any sort of statistical analysis, because we want to make sure that it's accurate. And then in our independent variable, I would argue that it doesn't actually matter if it is measured or self-reported, as long as it is clear which method they used, okay? So those are essential uses of BMI in research where a study would actually not be feasible without the use of the tool. Let's take a really quick look here at BMI as a superfluous variable in research. So in other cases, the use of BMI is not directly tied to the research question. And that means that it has been collected as additional data, but doesn't feature as data being used to better understand the phenomenon. Usually that means that it's being collected as part of demographic data and is considered to be an attribute valuable, or variable, something that gives quality and texture and a better understanding of the sample population. Okay, some important considerations exist when we're including BMI in this context, because this is where things get a little questionable. Okay, the first one is, what assumptions are implied in the collection of BMI here? How is it relevant if we're not talking about it directly? If it's not going to be used to better understand a phenomenon, what role does it play? And what assumptions are present when we include it? Okay, so that's a really good kind of self-reflection as you're going through. Is BMI even acknowledged in the text? Okay, so if data was gathered, whether or not that data was used, usually you would expect to see it acknowledged in the test. They will talk about a participant section where they say our participants were between the ages of 18 to 30, who had incomes between 60,000 and 80,000, and you should expect to see BMI averaging from this to this with a median of this. Okay, so our population was representative. This is who we talked to. Okay, what I've noticed is that's not always the case. They will sometimes put it in if, for whatever reason, the levels of the participants that they happened to select were outliers, were significantly off from the general population. But generally, they presume that the data is close enough and don't make a whole lot of reference to it in general. Okay, so that brings us to our next one. Did the BMI data align with the general population? Because again, if you think back, both qualitative and quantitative studies were seeking to determine whether or not this same result would exist in different contexts. So it's actually really important to get a population that is as close to the general population as possible. It's called generalizability, and we're looking to the best of our ability, manage all of these different variables so that we're drawing as close to a comprehensive view of the population as possible. And usually where there are gaps in that, we'll talk about it in limitations. So again, we would be looking for, is weight data or BMI data included in the participant description or in the limitations of the study? If it's not included in either, then that should give us pause. And finally, if BMI was addressed in the text, was there discussion on its limitations, right? So again, now we're in the limitation section, and I'm not just talking about the attribute variable here. I'm talking about BMI as a whole. Was there any mention of this tool is a little problematic and probably shouldn't be used to make sweeping assumptions about people's health? Okay, so that's what we're looking for in its limitations. Let me tell you, that has not been the case in the research I have seen in the last couple of weeks. So I undertook a quasi-literature study on a focused variable. So what that means is in my literature review, I wasn't looking to know more about the topic. I was looking to know more about the method. And I was really curious to deconstruct this attribute variable that we talk about. So I looked at 17 studies. That's not a huge amount. Ideally, I would have looked at closer to 50 or 60, but I only had 10 pages to work with in my paper. And I only had so much time to work with because it was a 5-week course. So I looked at 17 studies and I found 10 quantitative and 7 qualitative, all of which were related to the topic of exercise motivation, including barriers and facilitators to physical activity and exercise. So I used the same search criteria to find all of this research, and I did not include the terms BMI, body weight, weight, stigma, or weight loss. Okay, I did not include any terms that would evoke studies that were specifically including BMI. Okay, so they naturally evolved on their own. In my research, I found that 6 included BMI as essential data. It was actually really integral to the study. 2 of them were using it as inclusion criteria, so specifically looking at populations classified by BMI. One of whom was in overweight and obese classified women who are already physically active. The other in Afro-Caribbean classified obese and overweight women of all types, so all levels of physical activity, just looking at exercise motivation. One study used it as a dependent variable, so actually told us whether or not there was change in the BMI of their participants, and there was no change in the BMI of their participants in this study. And 3 of them used it as a mediator variable, so actually went through to see if BMI changed the psychological experience of exercise motivation or the experience of barriers and facilitators. And there we did see some interesting moderation and mediation analysis coming out, telling us what we probably already know, that when you have a body that is not well accommodated, not well represented, and not well respected, where your dignity and your worth are not valued by the industry, jumping in full speed is not always the easiest thing to do. So it is not super surprising to see BMI as an important mediator there. Okay. 2 studies discussed weight and BMI extensively in the background and the discussion of the research, but they didn't actually reference the BMI of the population that they gathered. So they were like, people with high levels of BMI are unhealthy. People with high levels of BMI don't exercise. People with high levels of BMI are prone to all these conditions, and then didn't actually discuss how any of that was relevant to the topic of exercise motivation, barriers, and facilitators. A little odd, a little questionable, a little bit of an indication of weight bias or stigma at play. Okay. 4 collected BMI data, but didn't reference weight or BMI whatsoever. That took me by surprise. I was shocked to see a study analyzing why people would be motivated to join different types of gyms that included BMI data, but that didn't include things like race or gender and wasn't looking at demographics in general, was really only very interested in the gendered question. So why men and women, and socioeconomic question. Why did richer versus less privileged people choose different facilities? So it included BMI data, but to no real end. One referenced the limitations of BMI as a tool. 1 in 17 studies referenced BMI's limitations. One had multiple participants withdraw from the study because they refused to give their weight and height. Interestingly enough, that's all they said. They left it there. They're like, yep, these people didn't want to do it because they wouldn't play game or play ball, and didn't actually think critically on whether or not that was important information to analyze and assess. 4 did not reference BMI or weight at all. 4 studies of the 17. They were all all but 1, 3 qualitative and 1 quantitative study. And so they were talking to people about their experiences. And quite frankly, in that context, it just wasn't relevant. They were talking to people with disabilities. They were talking to people who were stroke survivors, and they were talking to people who have moderate levels of mental illness. And so it wasn't really what they were trying to get at. And I would argue that most of these superfluous variable studies could have taken that same approach, because the outcomes of these 4 studies that didn't reference BMI were very, very similar and congruent and consistent with the information on their specialized population as well as on the general population as a whole. So there were no huge surprises that would have been better explained by BMI. And finally, one study was a bit of an outlier. It was fun to read. It came right out and said, we are not collecting BMI data. We are going to talk a lot about weight stigma. We are going to talk a lot about weight bias. We're going to talk a lot about how women aren't allowed to occupy space in their bodies. And I am making the methodological choice to not include weight information. And I thought that was a little bit fascinating. This author also actually put in that they were very limited in their study because they had known these people for a long time. They were a fitness instructor, kind of like me, that became an exercise psychology researcher. And that some of the limitations of their study is that they actually knew each other too well. They had worked together for 3 years doing this ethnographic study, and a lot of presumptions of what the answers would be likely emerged in the results. So some areas for reflection. Hi, Lyndon. It's my favorite picture of Lyndon because they look so joyful as they walk on the tread climber. And Lyndon is my absolute partner in crime in designing the Fit, Fat, Fearless. I think it's Fat, Fit, Fearless triple F program that we are starting very soon, which is super, super exciting. They are a wonderful, brilliant mind of social justice and restorative justice, and are going to bring this amazing lens to our conversation. So hi, Lyndon. Some reflections that I would like you to take before I kind of round us off on this one is, why was BMI included in these studies? What do we think they were trying to say? Did it contribute to the results, or did it contribute to the body of bias and to this underlying belief that anytime we're talking about exercise, physical activity, anything like that, that we automatically have to subdivide people on the basis of their weight? Knowing what we know about this tool, is that still actually an effective method? We ask ourselves, how did the participants feel giving this data? That's a really interesting question, especially knowing that 3 people refused to participate based just on that, right? I can tell you, if someone came up to me and said, hey, do you want to fill out a survey telling me why you choose to work out at the City of Edmonton? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And they said, cool, how much do you weigh? I'm not sure that would land particularly well with me, and I'd have no interest in doing their study. Unfortunately, that research didn't tell me how many people refused. And so I have no idea what the respondent bias was, what the participation bias was. Okay. How did collecting BMI reinforce inaccurate perceptions of body size in exercise motivation? That's a really, really big one, especially as we're trying to think about how do we get more people moving and how do we deconstruct this idea that physical activity only belongs to thin-bodied humans? So really reflecting and sitting with that and going, wow, I really need to be critical about the body of research that has been the foundation upon which all of our knowledge on exercise psychology has been built. Since the 1950s, we've been including this data, and we have been relying on it as if it was a really effective tool. But the tool is really problematic. So what does that mean for us as we look at our evidence and think about it critically? Did the background and body of evidence present or contribute to weight bias or stigma in research? Again, it depends on the study, depends on what the point was. But it's a pretty reasonable guess that if it was included for no reason except to include it, it probably has some hints of bias. And you want to go through that text to make sure that there aren't unrelated or unsubstantiated conclusions that built the foundation, the premise of the question, or that are included in the conclusion of the study. How will clinicians be impacted by reading the results, and how will they interpret some of this data as they're breaking it down, whether it was included, whether it was not included, statements saying, I am deliberately choosing to not include this, statements saying BMI is a questionable tool that should not be over applied in contexts beyond what it can measure. Okay, how is that impacting our clinicians? Do we need to see more of that? And do researchers have a responsibility to actually play an active role in that? So something else to consider there as well. More effective tools can measure and assess body composition. Right now we're using BMI because it's super convenient and easy, but do we really want our research tools to depend on convenience and ease? Are there any other fields where we would continue to use this questionable, this controversial a tool and call it science, right? So I think that as soon as we have major issues and questions about validity and credibility, we have to get curious about whether or not that tool still serves a meaningful purpose. So that would be my argument in that. Are there other examples in science where we rely on tools? We just talked about that. And what implications are there for other attribute variables, age, weight, gender, and race? So I'll be honest with you, this was my entry point into a much bigger discussion that I hope to have over the next kind of 3 years as I work through evidence and question research critically from the counseling psychology perspective. I'm going to give you one really easy one, kind of like BMI, but much grayer in how we go about it. Now that science has told us, without and beyond the shadow of a doubt, that gender is more complex than the binary that we believe it to be of male and female, even if we only account for the the intersex population. So even if we're only looking at that and we don't extend it to transgender populations and non-binary populations, just the existence of intersex populations calls into question male versus female as an attribute variable. And if we call that into question, we have to get really curious about literally every study that has ever been done looking at gender, if it only controlled for those two. Because all of those studies now have a possible issue in their sample population, in how they've constructed their language and their methodology, in the definitions of their variables and their populations, huge methodological concerns. And right now, we don't have a method for thinking about those things critically. Right now, we're just kind of covering our face and saying, let's just not discuss it. Let's not talk about the fact that there are huge populations that we have literally never looked at because they could not have participated or would have had to be dishonest and misrepresentative in their participation, which is arguably worse, right? People selecting a gender when their body profile and psychological profile doesn't fit into those two boxes very clearly. So sit with that a little bit, right? What does that mean for disability? What does that mean for age? All of these constructs that we're now starting to understand are so much more complicated than we used to think they were. So with that, I leave you with one big question, which is, I guess, kind of my problem statement, my coming out of this research going, more research needs to be done to address this question. Should researchers have an ethical responsibility to consider the social impacts of using attribute data as a whole? So I believe, I hope I have identified that there is at the very least an important question to be asked about BMI based on multiple different areas of bias. But if that's true, if we accept that we need to be critical about our attribute variable, that we can't just ask people for personal information and collect data for no purpose, it needs to serve a purpose. If we accept that as true, do we not need, by definition, to include a social justice component to our ethical considerations and methodological approaches? Should this not become its own methodological norm as we move forward, thinking about how language and constructs and society are ever changing and ever evolving, and that research will never be able to keep up with the changes in population? So that's what I wanted to leave you with. I am going to turn this off in terms of the recording, but I invite you to chat with me. I'm just going to leave this on the screen for a few seconds for people who might want to screenshot so we can chat more about it. And I'm so grateful to you for joining me. I had a wonderful time in these two courses. They've totally sparked my fire for diving into this field even more and have made me want to come to work every day and share with you what I'm learning and what I'm hoping to bring to the table in terms of our questions to the scientific community. So thank you, my friends. Have a wonderful, wonderful night. Oh my gosh, did I not start? Oh no, that's my video. Okay, good. Whew, I scared myself there. I'm gonna stop my share. I'm gonna stop my video. I'm gonna come in, stop my recording. There we go.